The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as Officer James Miller settled into his patrol car with his second cup of coffee. It was just another Sunday morning in the quiet town of Riverbrook, the kind of morning where the biggest excitement usually came from giving directions to lost tourists or helping elderly residents with their groceries. Miller had been with the Riverbrook Police Department for 15 years, long enough to know every street corner and most of the town's residents by name. His fellow officers often joked that he could navigate the town blindfolded, and truthfully, they weren't far off. The familiar rhythm of his morning patrols had become second nature, like reading a well-worn book. The spring air carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry trees as Miller cruised past the old hardware store. Mrs. Thompson, the owner's wife, was already sweeping the sidewalk, just like she did every Sunday morning. She waved, and Miller returned the greeting with a friendly nod. These small-town moments were what he loved most about his job. But today would prove different from the countless patrols that came before it. As Miller approached the intersection of Pine and Oak, a faded blue pickup truck caught his attention. The vehicle, probably from the early 2000s, had seen better days. Its paint was chipped, and the rear bumper bore the battle scars of minor fender benders. What really caught Miller's eye, though, wasn't the truck's appearance, but how it moved through the intersection, rolling past the stop sign as if it wasn't there. "Here we go," Miller muttered to himself, placing his coffee in the cup holder. He'd handled thousands of traffic stops in his career. They were usually straightforward affairs that ended with a warning or a ticket. He flipped on his lights, expecting the typical immediate response. A driver pulling over, looking anxious in the rearview mirror. But this driver's reaction was different. The truck continued for another block, moving at exactly the speed limit, neither speeding up nor slowing down. Miller noticed the driver's military straight posture through the slightly tinted rear window, not the usual slouch of a teenager or the casual position of a commuter. Something about that posture stirred a memory in Miller's mind, but he couldn't quite place it. When the truck finally pulled over, it did so with precise movements, perfectly parallel to the curb. Miller radioed in his location, following protocol, but his instincts were already telling him this wouldn't be a routine stop. As he approached the driver's side, he noticed small details that most people would miss: a faded military branch sticker in the corner of the rear window, partially peeled away by time and weather, and a license plate frame that had once held some kind of service insignia, though it was now too worn to read. The driver sat perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, just like they teach in driver's ed. But something was off. Even from a few steps away, Miller could see the slight tremor in those hands, the way the knuckles had whitened from gripping the wheel too tight. Through the window, Miller caught a glimpse of the driver's face in the side mirror. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, with salt and pepper hair cut short in a style that hadn't quite let go of its military precision. His eyes, fixed straight ahead, held a 1,000-yard stare that Miller had seen before, though it took him a moment to remember where. As Miller reached the driver's window, he followed his usual procedure, but something in his gut told him to move more slowly, to speak more softly than usual. "Good morning, sir," he said, keeping his tone casual but clear. "License and registration, please." The driver's response would be the first indication that this Sunday morning traffic stop was about to become something much more significant, a moment that would change both their lives and reshape how the entire department approached similar situations in the future. The man's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, as if the simple request had short-circuited something in his brain. His hands remained frozen on the steering wheel, knuckles growing whiter by the second. When he finally spoke, his voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the sound of passing cars. "Sir," the man said, "I need to tell you something, but I don't want you to misunderstand." Officer Miller's hand instinctively moved closer to his hip, years of training kicking in. But something in the man's voice, a mix of fear and resignation, made him pause. This wasn't the typical nervousness of someone with something to hide. This was something else entirely, something that would soon turn a routine traffic stop into one of the most memorable moments of Miller's career. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was only a matter of seconds. The veteran, Sam Richardson, finally moved his right hand from the steering wheel, the movement so slow and deliberate it almost seemed painful. Officer Miller watched carefully, noting how the man's breathing had become shallow and quick. My papers are in the glove compartment," Richardson managed to say, his voice carrying the weight of someone fighting an invisible battle. "I need to reach over to get them." Each word seemed carefully chosen, delivered with the precision of someone who knew how crucial clear communication was in moments like these. Miller nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor while shifting slightly to get a better view of the passenger side. "Go ahead, sir. Just take your time." The morning traffic continued to pass by, each car creating a gentle whoosh that seemed to make Richardson flinch ever so slightly. As Richardson reached for the glove compartment, Miller noticed more details about the truck's interior. A small air freshener shaped like a pine tree hung limply from the rearview mirror, its scent long gone. A worn photograph was tucked into the corner of the dashboard, the kind of personal touch that told stories about its owner. The interior was spotlessly clean, almost obsessively so, with everything arranged in perfect order. The glove compartment's latch gave a sharp click as it opened, and Richardson's hand trembled more visibly now. Papers shuffled inside as he searched, each movement becoming more agitated. A few documents slipped from his grasp, scattering across the passenger seat floor. "I'm sorry," Richardson said, his voice cracking slightly. "I just organized these yesterday. They were right here." Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the cool spring morning. His breathing became more ragged, and Miller could see him struggling to maintain his composure. The scattered papers revealed glimpses of their contents, medical forms with the VA hospital letterhead, appointment reminders, and what looked like prescription information. Miller's trained eye caught these details even as he maintained his focus on Richardson's movements. "Sir, would you like to take a moment?" Miller offered, his tone softening slightly. He'd seen panic attacks before, both on the job and during his time in service. The signs were becoming clearer with each passing second. Richardson shook his head, almost mechanically. "No, sir, I can do this." His military bearing showed through even in his distress, that ingrained refusal to show weakness, to complete the mission no matter what. He finally managed to grab what looked like a registration paper, but his hands were shaking so badly now that he dropped it twice before getting it to the window. As Miller took the offered document, he noticed Richardson's forearms. The sleeves of his flannel shirt had pulled back slightly, revealing distinctive scars that told their own story of service and sacrifice. The registration paper itself was worn at the edges, as if it had been handled and refolded many times. The situation was rapidly moving beyond a simple traffic violation. Miller glanced at the registration, noting immediately that it was outdated. Under normal circumstances, this would be a straightforward citation, maybe even grounds for further investigation. But the growing tension in Richardson's jaw, the way his eyes darted between mirrors, and his increasingly labored breathing suggested that standard procedure might not be the best approach. "Sir, I'm also going to need to see your license," Miller said, keeping his voice steady and calm. The mention of additional documentation seemed to push Richardson closer to the edge. His knuckles whitened against the steering wheel again, and a visible tremor ran through his shoulders. It's in my wallet," Richardson managed to say. "Back pocket." He started to shift in his seat, but the movement seemed to trigger something. His eyes suddenly lost focus, staring straight ahead, but seeing something far beyond the quiet street in front of him. The morning had grown warmer, but Richardson's face had gone pale. His next words came out in a whisper that seemed to carry echoes of places far from this peaceful suburban street. I need a minute, sir. Please." Officer Miller's hand moved away from his utility belt, where it had instinctively rested. Years of experience told him this moment could go in several different directions. The protocol floating through his mind said one thing, but his instincts, honed by both his police work and his own military service, were telling him something entirely different. The registration issues, the obvious distress, the medical papers, pieces of a puzzle were coming together, but not in the way Miller had initially expected when he'd first turned on his lights to pull over the faded blue pickup. As he stood there, watching Richardson battle his internal demons, Miller knew the next few moments would be crucial for both of them. What happened next would challenge everything Miller knew about standard procedure, forcing him to choose between following protocol and following his humanity. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, casting new shadows across the scene, as both men stood on the precipice of a moment that would change them both forever. The outdated registration was just the beginning. As Officer Miller studied the worn document in his hands, he noticed several concerning details. The address listed didn't match the local county, and there were inconsistencies in the renewal dates that raised red flags in his mind. Standard procedure began flashing through his thoughts like a well-rehearsed script. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Miller said, his voice firm but measured. The words seemed to hang in the morning air like heavy fog. Richardson's reaction was immediate and intense. His whole body went rigid, and his breathing, which had already been irregular, became sharp and shallow. The change in his demeanor was like watching a switch flip. One moment he was barely holding it together, the next he was somewhere else entirely. "I can't," Richardson whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes had taken on a glassy, distant look. "I can't get out. Not here, not in the open." His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone from white to a concerning shade of purple. Miller noticed the subtle signs that things were escalating. The way Richardson's shoulders hunched forward protectively. The slight rocking motion he'd begun, probably without even realizing it. The beads of sweat now rolling down his temples despite the mild spring temperature. A car horn blared somewhere down the street, and Richardson nearly jumped out of his skin. His reaction was far more than simple startlement. His whole body convulsed as if he'd been shocked, and a small wounded sound escaped his throat. "Too loud," he muttered, seemingly to himself. "Too exposed. Need cover. Need." His words trailed off into rapid, shallow breathing that was quickly becoming hyperventilation. Miller's training kicked in, but not his police training. Something from his military days surfaced, memories of similar episodes he'd witnessed in the barracks, in the field, and even in himself during those first few months back home. "Sir, focus on my voice," Miller said, purposely lowering his tone and speaking with careful clarity. "You're on Pine Street in Riverbrook. It's 9:47 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The coffee shop across the street is just opening up. You can probably smell the fresh coffee from here." Richardson's eyes flickered briefly toward Miller's voice, but his breathing remained erratic. His left hand had moved from the steering wheel to his chest, clutching at his shirt as if he couldn't get enough air. "I need to check some information," Miller continued, maintaining his calm tone while reaching for his radio. This was protocol, calling in the vehicle information, requesting backup for an uncooperative subject. But something made him hesitate. The way Richardson tracked his movement toward the radio was telling. There was fear there, yes, but also something like resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment and dreading it all along. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery, mixing with the exhaust fumes from passing cars. These ordinary Sunday morning sounds and smells seemed to exist in a different world from the crisis unfolding in the faded blue pickup truck. "Please," Richardson managed between gasps, "my papers, VA hospital, I just moved." His words came out fragmented, each one a struggle against the panic that was clearly overwhelming him. "Can't go back. Can't." Miller's hand stayed hovering over his radio. The growing crowd of curious onlookers at the coffee shop across the street added another layer of pressure to the situation. He could see phones being raised, people likely recording what they assumed would be another viral police confrontation video. The next few moments would be crucial. Protocol said one thing: an uncooperative subject with irregular documentation needed to be removed from the vehicle and properly identified. But Miller's instincts, honed by years of service both in the military and on the force, were screaming that this situation needed a different approach. Richardson's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing had become so labored that Miller worried he might pass out. The veteran's eyes darted frantically between the rearview mirror, the side mirrors, and the growing crowd of onlookers, his panic visibly mounting with each passing second. Just as Miller began to reach for his car door handle, planning to retrieve his medical kit with its smelling salts, something fell from Richardson's wallet, which had been sitting precariously on his lap. The small piece of plastic spun as it fell, catching the morning sunlight and drawing both men's attention. The military ID card landed face up on the truck's floor mat, and its appearance would mark the turning point in this increasingly tense situation. But neither man knew yet just how significant this small piece of plastic would prove to be, or how it would transform what had started as a routine traffic stop into something that would change both their lives forever. The military ID card lay face up on the floor mat, its laminated surface reflecting the morning sunlight. For a moment, both men's attention fixed on this small piece of plastic that would change everything. Officer Miller's hand, which had been reaching for his handcuffs, froze in mid-motion. As Richardson made a desperate grab for the fallen ID, his sleeve rode up further, fully exposing his forearms. Miller's breath caught in his throat. The scars he'd glimpsed earlier told the story he knew all too well, the distinctive marks of shrapnel wounds, healed but never forgotten. But it was something else that made Miller's police training suddenly take a back seat to his military experience. On Richardson's right wrist was a black band, worn and faded, but Miller recognized it instantly. It was the kind of memorial bracelet soldiers wore to honor fallen comrades. Miller unconsciously touched his own wrist, where a similar band had left its mark on his skin over the years, though he'd stopped wearing it physically long ago. "Wait," Miller said, his voice softening. He took a step back from the truck, creating space, not out of concern for his safety now, but to give Richardson room to breathe. "That's a 10th Mountain Division badge on your ID." Richardson's panicked movements slowed slightly, his eyes meeting Miller's for the first time since the stop began. You know the 10th." His voice was still strained, but there was a note of surprise that cut through the panic. "Fort Drum, New York," Miller replied, deliberately keeping his hands visible and away from his utility belt. "I was there before transferring to the MPs. That winter training was something else, wasn't it?" A flicker of recognition crossed Richardson's face. His breathing, while still rapid, began to show signs of steadying. "The winter training," he repeated, almost to himself. Yeah, it was. They called us the Arctic Angels. Because of the cold." Miller nodded, taking another small step back. The growing crowd across the street had lost interest in what now appeared to be just two men talking, their phones lowering one by one. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the spring air around them. "I served as a combat medic," Richardson continued, his words coming easier now as he focused on the familiar topic. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Kunar province. His hands had loosened their death grip on the steering wheel, though they still trembled slightly. Miller noticed other details now, things his police training had initially flagged as suspicious, but his military experience now read differently. The way Richardson sat with his back perfectly straight, his precise movements, the obsessively organized truck interior, all hallmarks of military discipline maintained as a coping mechanism. The memorial bracelet caught the sunlight as Richardson's hand moved to his chest, where his breathing was finally beginning to normalize. "Lost my best friend there," he said quietly. "Lieutenant Parker. You strike. I couldn't. I was the medic, but I couldn't." "You don't have to explain," Miller interrupted gently, recognizing the path those memories would lead down. He'd walked it himself too many times. "I lost people too. Nobody comes back quite the same." A look of profound relief washed over Richardson's face, the kind that comes from being truly understood. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, if only slightly. His eyes, which had been darting everywhere, now focused more steadily on Miller. "I've been trying to get help," Richardson explained, gesturing to the scattered VA papers on the passenger seat. "The move to this area, the new VA hospital, everything's been." He trailed off, but Miller understood. Change was hard enough for anyone. For veterans dealing with PTSD, it could be overwhelming. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, but the atmosphere between the two men had transformed. What had started as a confrontation was becoming something else entirely, a moment of connection between two soldiers who'd walked similar paths. "Listen," Miller said, picking up the fallen ID card and holding it out to Richardson. "I think we need to talk about more than just a traffic violation here." He gestured to his patrol car. "The coffee in my thermos is still hot, and I know a quiet spot just around the corner where we can sort this out. No crowds, no noise, just two vets talking. What do you say?" Richardson looked at the offered ID, then at Miller, seeing him not as a threat now, but as something else, a potential ally in a battle he'd been fighting alone for too long. The morning sun caught the badges on both men's chests, one a police shield, the other visible on the military ID, both symbols of service that suddenly seemed to bridge an important gap. This moment of recognition would prove to be more than just a turning point in a traffic stop. It would become the foundation for something much larger, something that would impact not just these two men, but an entire community's approach to veterans in crisis. Around the corner from the initial traffic stop, in a quiet parking lot behind the old community center, 2 paper cups of coffee steamed in the morning air. Officer Miller had pulled his patrol car alongside Richardson's truck, creating a private space away from curious eyes and traffic noise. "I signed up right after high school," Richardson began, his hands wrapped around a warm cup. The trembling had subsided, though his voice still carried the weight of memories he usually kept locked away. "My dad was a medic in Vietnam. I guess I wanted to follow in his footsteps, help people like he did." The coffee's aroma seemed to ground him, giving him something familiar to focus on as he spoke. Miller listened quietly, recognizing that Richardson needed to tell his story at his own pace. "First tour wasn't so bad," Richardson continued, looking past the rim of his cup into the distance. "We did good work. Built clinics, treated local kids, trained Afghan medical staff. I felt like I was making a difference, you know." Miller nodded, remembering his own early days of service, when everything seemed clearer, more purposeful. The morning sun had warmed the air around them, and somewhere nearby, birds were singing their spring songs. Second tour, things changed. Richardson's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. "We lost 3 guys in the first month. IEDs were everywhere. I spent more time patching up combat wounds than helping civilians. But I could handle it. That's what we trained for, right?" He paused, taking a slow sip of coffee. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the scent of blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the desert landscapes he was describing. "Third tour," Richardson's voice cracked slightly. "That's when it happened. We were running a medical convoy to a remote village. Lieutenant Parker, Tom, he was my best friend since basic. We'd been through everything together." He stopped, gathering himself. Miller waited patiently, understanding the difficulty of revisiting such memories. His own coffee sat untouched, steam curling into the morning air. "The explosion came out of nowhere. One minute we're joking about Tom's kid's first birthday coming up, the next, Richardson's free hand unconsciously moved to the memorial bracelet on his wrist. I was the senior medic. I should have saved him. I tried everything, used every bit of training I had, but..." His voice trailed off, but the unspoken words hung heavy in the air between them. Miller recognized the survivor's guilt. He'd seen it in too many good soldiers, carried some of it himself. "After that, everything fell apart," Richardson continued, his voice steadier now, but hollow. "Came back home, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus. The VA diagnosed me with severe PTSD. Lost my civilian paramedic job because I kept freezing up during emergency calls. The sirens, the pressure, it all brought me back there." He gestured to the scattered papers in his truck. "Been moving around, trying different VA programs. This new hospital here, they're supposed to have a good PTSD treatment program. But the move," he shook his head. "Everything's so complicated now. Forgot to transfer my vehicle registration, can barely keep track of appointments. Some days, just leaving the house feels like gearing up for a combat mission." Miller listened, seeing the registration violation in a completely new light. What had started as a routine traffic stop had revealed a much deeper story, one of service, sacrifice, and the ongoing battles many veterans fought long after leaving the battlefield. 3 days ago, Richardson added, his voice barely above a whisper, would have been Tom's birthday, his kids in high school now. "I still can't bring myself to visit them, to face his wife. How do you tell someone you couldn't save their husband when that was your whole job?" The question hung in the air, not really expecting an answer. A nearby church bell told the hour, its deep, resonant sound rolling across the quiet parking lot. Both men sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of Richardson's story settle between them. Miller finally spoke, choosing his words carefully. "You know, when I first became a cop, I thought it would be simpler than military service. Clear rules, clear procedures. But I've learned that sometimes the right thing to do isn't always what's written in the manual." He reached into his patrol car and pulled out a notepad, but not to write a ticket. What he wrote instead would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just Richardson's life, but the lives of countless other veterans in their community. Officer Miller set his notepad down and leaned back against his patrol car, his posture deliberately relaxed. The morning had grown warmer, and the parking lot remained their private sanctuary away from the bustle of Main Street traffic. "You mentioned the new VA hospital," Miller said, his tone conversational rather than interrogatory. "The one over on Riverside Drive?" He watched as Richardson's expression shifted from confusion to slight surprise at this change in direction. "Yeah," Richardson replied, some tension leaving his shoulders. "Been trying to get into their PTSD program. The waiting list is—" He trailed off, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. 2 months, Miller finished for him. "I know. I help run a veteran support group that meets at the community center here." He gestured to the building behind them. "We've had a few members go through that program. Tough to get in, but worth the wait." Richardson's eyes widened slightly. The coffee in his cup had grown cold, forgotten as the conversation shifted to something more immediate, more relevant. "You know," Miller continued, "when I first came back and joined the force, I thought I was fine. Thought I'd left everything overseas." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Then one 4th of July, I'm on patrol, and some kids set off fireworks right behind me. Next thing I know, I'm behind my patrol car, weapon drawn, heart racing like I'm back in Kandahar." The admission hung in the air between them. Richardson's hands had stopped shaking entirely now, his attention fully focused on Miller's words. "My training sergeant found me like that," Miller went on. "Could have ended my career right there. But instead, he sat with me for 2 hours just talking. Turned out he was a Gulf War vet. He understood. That's when I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves of a nearby oak tree, its shadows dancing on the pavement between them. The church bells chimed the half-hour, but this time Richardson didn't flinch at the sound. "The support group meets every Tuesday evening," Miller said, pulling out a business card from his shirt pocket. "It's not official VA therapy, just vets talking to vets. No pressure, no paperwork. Some nights we just watch the game and grab pizza." Richardson took the card, studying it with the same intensity he'd probably once given to mission briefings. I haven't been good with groups," he admitted. "The crowds, the noise." Miller nodded understandingly. "First time I came, I sat in my car for an hour before going in. Second time, I made it to the door and turned around. Third time," he smiled slightly. "Third time, someone saw me in the parking lot and just walked out to sit with me. Sometimes that's all it takes, knowing you're not alone in this." The sounds of the awakening town drifted over to them, car doors closing, distant conversations, the hum of daily life continuing around their quiet moment of connection. But these ordinary noises seemed less threatening now, less overwhelming. "About your registration," Miller said, glancing at his notepad. "There's a Veterans Assistance Office downtown that helps with paperwork, vehicle registration, housing, all of it. The lady who runs it, she's got a wall full of military photos. Her son served in Iraq. She makes it her mission to help vets navigate the system." Richardson's posture had changed subtly throughout their conversation. The rigid, defensive position had softened. His shoulders had dropped from their tense height, and his breathing had found a natural rhythm. "You know what the hardest part is?" Richardson asked suddenly, his voice steady for the first time since the traffic stop began. "Everyone expects you to just move on, like you can leave it all behind. They don't understand that sometimes the smallest things, a car backfiring, a door slamming, can take you right back there." Miller nodded, remembering his own struggles with those unexpected triggers. "That's why having people who understand makes all the difference. In our group, you don't have to explain why you need to sit facing the door or why certain sounds make you jumpy. We get it." He reached into his patrol car and pulled out a folder, different from his ticket book. "I've got some contact numbers here. Peer counselors, veteran advocates, people who can help with the practical stuff while you're waiting for the VA program." The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the last of the spring morning's chill. In the distance, a lawnmower started up, and both men instinctively tensed, then shared a knowing look that acknowledged their shared response. "You're not alone in this fight," Miller said quietly, handing over the folder of resources. "And sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is accept reinforcements when they need them." Richardson took the folder, his hands steady now. The military precision was still there in his movements, but it no longer seemed like a defensive armor, just a part of who he was, like the memorial bracelet he wore or the memories he carried. The rest of that Sunday morning unfolded differently than either man had expected. Instead of writing a ticket, Officer Miller spent the next hour helping Richardson organize his paperwork and making a plan. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as they mapped out the steps needed to get everything back in order. "First stop," Miller said, checking his watch. "Let's head over to the Veterans Assistance Office. I know the weekend coordinator. She comes in on Sundays specifically to help vets who work during the week." He picked up his radio to let dispatch know he'd be escorting a veteran to give assistance. The drive downtown was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence of their earlier encounter. Richardson followed Miller's patrol car in his pickup, his posture noticeably more relaxed. At each stoplight, Miller checked his rearview mirror, watching for signs of distress, but saw only determination in Richardson's expression. The Veterans Assistance Office was housed in an old brick building, its windows decorated with flags from all branches of service. As they pulled into the parking lot, an older woman was already waiting at the door, her warm smile and casual dress making the place feel more like a family gathering than a government office. "I called ahead," Miller explained as they walked up. "Mrs. Anderson here has helped dozens of vets get their paperwork sorted out. She's got a gift for cutting through red tape." The next few hours passed in a blur of forms and phone calls. Mrs. Anderson moved through the process with efficient grace, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she helped Richardson navigate the system. What would have taken weeks to accomplish alone was handled in a single morning, thanks to her knowledge and connections. But something even more important was happening beneath the surface. As Richardson shared pieces of his story, Mrs. Anderson listened with the understanding of someone who had heard similar tales many times before. She shared stories about other veterans who had overcome similar challenges, carefully avoiding names but painting pictures of hope and recovery. By early afternoon, Richardson had a new vehicle registration, appointments scheduled with the VA, and something else he hadn't expected, a sense of belonging. The wall of military photos that Miller had mentioned turned out to include several from the 10th Mountain Division, and Richardson spent time studying them, occasionally sharing his own memories of familiar locations. "You know," Mrs. Anderson said as she filed the last of the paperwork, "we could use someone with medical training at our weekend veteran outreach events. A lot of our older vets have trouble making it to regular appointments." Richardson hesitated, but Miller stepped in. "Start small," he suggested. "Maybe come to the Tuesday group first, get comfortable. The outreach events will still be there when you're ready." As they walked back to their vehicles, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Richardson paused by his truck, looking at the folder of resources in his hands. "I never thought a traffic stop would," he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. "Sometimes the best help comes from unexpected places," Miller replied. "Just remember what you told me about being a medic, how you never gave up on anyone under your care. Well, we're not giving up on you either." That Sunday traffic stop could have ended very differently. It could have been just another confrontation, another veteran lost in the system. Instead, it became the catalyst for change, not just for Richardson, but for the entire department. In the months that followed, Officer Miller worked with his superiors to establish new protocols for handling veteran encounters. Training sessions were developed, incorporating insights from mental health professionals and veterans themselves. The Tuesday support group grew, with Richardson eventually becoming one of its most dedicated members. The changes rippled outward. Other police departments in neighboring counties began adopting similar approaches. The VA hospital started coordinating with local law enforcement to better serve veterans in crisis. Mrs. Anderson's outreach programs expanded, supported by a network of volunteers who understood the importance of meeting veterans where they were. And Richardson? He did eventually start helping at those weekend outreach events. His experience as a medic, combined with his own journey of recovery, made him uniquely qualified to understand and assist other veterans. The skills that had once saved lives on the battlefield were now helping save lives in a different way. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, Miller sat in the back of the community center, watching Richardson lead a session of the Tuesday group. The former medic was sharing his story with a new veteran, someone else who needed to hear that they weren't alone. The memorial bracelet still circled Richardson's wrist, but it was no longer a burden of guilt. It had become a reminder of why this work mattered. As Miller looked around a room full of veterans helping veterans, he remembered something his old sergeant used to say. Sometimes the most important battles we fight are the ones that help us find our way back home. That Sunday morning traffic stop hadn't just been about checking registration or enforcing laws. It had been about recognizing a fellow soldier who needed backup, about understanding that service to others doesn't end when the uniform comes off. And in that understanding, both men had found a new kind of mission, one that would continue to touch lives and change policies for years to come. What had started as a potential arrest had transformed into something much more meaningful, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is stop, listen, and remember that behind every encounter, there's a human story waiting to be heard.